A Thing in the Woods. Chapter 13. When I heard Lucy scream, adrenaline surged through my body. My brain was fully awake within a matter of seconds, and I was on my feet before I knew what was happening. My parents were already in her room, and I could hear them urgently asking Lucy questions. I heard Lucy sobbing in a way that I'd only heard from a small child before that morning. I would love to be able to tell you that my instinct to defend and protect my family kicked in, and I was racing across the hall without a moment of hesitation, but the truth was that I was frozen in place, listening to those sounds. Unlike my parents, I knew what had caused Lucy to scream. I also knew that this marked a huge escalation in our encounters with the intruders. If they had done something bad to Lucy, they would do something bad to me. And I stood in my bedroom staring at Lucy's doorway because I didn't want to know what had happened to her. If I didn't know about it, it wasn't real. If it wasn't real, I didn't have to do anything about it. I could make out some of what Lucy was telling my parents in between sobs. I could hear that she was telling them about someone in her room. I could hear her tell my parents that she couldn't move. The more I heard, the more I wanted it all to go away. But I needed to hear it. I had no choice but to accept the fact that I was a part of this, and I needed as much information as I could get. I walked out of my room, now hearing only muffled crying and quiet mumbling. I made my way across the hallway slowly and as quietly as possible, because I didn't want anyone to know that I was out there. There is something that parents do when something big is happening while their child is nearby. They remove the child from the situation, isolating them from what is happening, and do everything in their power to make that child believe that everything is just fine. Except, usually, the child knows that everything isn't just fine. The child saw the traumatic part and is swooped away before seeing any of the helpful processing of the situation. Then everyone acts as though it never happened, and the child is just left with that traumatic part and no way to resolve it. At least, this was what my parents had a habit of doing, and it's what they did to me this time. As I listened closely, trying to hear what Lucy was telling my parents, my father walked to the doorway and looked right at me. We locked eyes, and then he glanced over his shoulder at Lucy and my mother. Then he walked out into the hall, closing the door behind him, and he directed me downstairs. I wasn't a little kid. I was old enough to know when things were wrong. So, despite my father telling me that Lucy just had a bad dream and we needed to let her speak to my mother, I knew that something more was going on. There was no fighting my father or forcing my way into Lucy's room. There was no convincing them that if she was talking to anyone, it should be me because I was already a part of it. I just had to go with my father and try my hardest not to yell at him for trying to convince me that I was crazy for telling them what I had seen. I was angry. At that moment, I wanted a fight. I didn't care if I was fighting my father or the things that had been coming into my house. I just wanted to fight. And yet, I couldn't. I was still scared of being punished for telling my parents what I'd heard in my room, the same way I'd been punished the last time, and the same way I'd been punished for finding that body in the first place. Punishment was how I saw it. Why else would I be locked away? Why else would my parents be talking about shipping me off to some nut house? Those aren't things that you do for someone that you trust and believe. I remember stupid details from that day even more than I remember the big events. I remember sitting against the wall at the bottom of the stairs. As the surge of adrenaline began to fade, I felt cold. I was shaking, but tried not to let my father notice. I listened as hard as I could to hear the conversation upstairs, but I couldn't hear anything that was said. I couldn't even hear S or T sounds. My father was in the kitchen, keeping himself busy. First, he made coffee. The way I remember it, he was making a ton of noise as he did it. I don't know if he was trying to drown out the talking upstairs or if he was just shaking from his own fading adrenaline. Maybe it just seemed louder than normal because I was trying so hard to hear something else. But as I remember it, he was banging containers of coffee and slamming cabinet doors. Even the water sounded louder than normal as he filled the coffee maker. There was a ray of strong morning sunlight coming through the window, casting a harsh shadow on the floor in front of me. The clock on the mantel was ticking. The sound of it was hypnotic. The morning dragged as I waited for something to happen. I didn't know if we were going to have to call the police or go to the hospital. I didn't know if Lucy was calming down or if she was broken for good. Once the coffee was brewing, my father started to pace back and forth between the refrigerator and the oven. He had his hands clasped together as though he were praying, but I don't know if he was. I just remember the look on his face, as though he were trying his hardest to understand what was happening, but he couldn't wrap his mind around it. I heard my mother walking through the hall upstairs. She went into her bedroom for a few minutes and then into the bathroom. The coffee was ready, and my father poured 2 mugs, then took them upstairs. Normally, I would have expected him to say, "Excuse me," or "Scooch," as he squeezed past where I was sitting and went up the stairs, but he didn't say anything this time. Once he was up the stairs, I could hear movement and voices upstairs, but the house had the same empty feeling that it had on the few occasions when I'd been left home alone. I didn't know what to do with myself. I wanted to help Lucy, but I didn't know how. I wanted to go upstairs and listen to what was happening, but I knew that I'd just get pushed out of the way again. What I knew for sure was that if I were a few years older, I wouldn't have been shut out. I wouldn't have been alone. I wouldn't have been left to wonder and worry. I was angry, being shut out of something that I was a part of. It had been happening to me for days, and now I was on the sidelines because of my parents who didn't even believe in what was happening. They just thought I was crazy. Did that mean that Lucy was crazy now too? Or would they finally listen to me? I kept thinking about what Lucy had said to me the other morning. She told me that she hadn't heard anything. What did that mean? As my mind tried its best to fill in the details of a story that I didn't know, I imagined horrible, bloody, violent things that could have been happening to Lucy. I imagined the shadows coming to life and suffocating her. I imagined monsters trying to get through her window. I knew that these images were all in my head, but it didn't matter. Something had happened, and whatever it was real. Whatever it was had gone after Lucy, and it had to be the same thing that I had been hearing. I had no idea what to do about it. I just knew that it would keep happening every night until it got whatever it wanted. I kept asking myself what it did want, and I kept coming to the same terrifying conclusion. It wanted Lucy and me. There was a piece of yarn dangling from a blanket that had been tossed onto the couch. I watched the yarn as it blew in the breeze of a nearby air conditioning vent. I could hear the hiss of the air flowing through it. Outside, a truck drove by on the road, and I remember thinking to myself that the person in that truck had no idea what was going on inside of our house, hidden down a driveway behind some trees. We could be dead, and they'd still just drive on by. I thought I heard a laugh from upstairs, and for a split second I felt like things might be all right. Maybe Lucy had explained things to my parents, and they'd made sense of the whole thing. Maybe they were laughing at how absurd it was, and life could go back to normal. Except, the more I processed the sound of that laugh, I realized that it wasn't the sound of my mother laughing or Lucy. It certainly wasn't my father. This was the laugh of a small child, a little girl. When I realized this, I shot to my feet and looked across the house, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. I couldn't tell. It was coming from somewhere distant, but I didn't know where. My heart started pounding in my chest once again, and adrenaline shot through me. I ran up the stairs and into the hallway, looking from room to room, trying to find something out of the ordinary. The laugh was gone now. It was just a memory that echoed through my head as I searched desperately, on the verge of tears. It wasn't the middle of the night. I wasn't half asleep. The laugh had invaded the haven of daylight, and the loss of that haven was shattering to me. Lucy's door was closed, but it soon opened, and my father walked into the hallway, closing the door behind him. "You shouldn't be up here," he said to me. "Lucy and your mom need some time." I barely heard him as I struggled to figure out where I could go or what I could do to escape the intruders. I felt as though I were on the verge of tears, but I held them back. I looked at my father, only able to hide my fear so much. He could clearly see it in my eyes, and I wanted to blurt everything out. I wanted to beg him for help and cry and run away. In his eyes, however, I saw the same look that I'd seen before, the look of my father trying to placate his crazy son. So I lied. I told him that I was just worried about Lucy. She had screamed so loud, and I hadn't seen her since, and I was just worried about her. That was all. As I said this, I remembered seeing the blanket from my bed folded on the chair in my room when I woke up that morning. In all of the confusion, I hadn't even paid it any attention. Now I remembered it and realized that something had taken that blanket off of my bed while I slept. Something had folded it. Something that watched me sleep, which wanted me to know that it wasn't just harmless sounds in the night. I realized this while I was looking my father in the eyes, and I have no idea whether or not he saw the sheer terror that came over me in that moment. But he put his hands on my shoulders, and I could see the panic inside of him. "Let's go get some breakfast," he said calmly. I didn't want calm. I wanted my father to grab me and the rest of the family and run. I wanted weapons and shields. Instead, I got oatmeal. Dad and I were downstairs an hour or two later when Lucy finally came down with my mother. I could tell that Lucy had been crying hard, and she locked eyes with me as she came into the kitchen. She wanted to tell me what had happened, but she couldn't go into it with my parents around. She probably spent the entire morning trying to convince my mother that she wasn't crazy, so she couldn't tell me. At least, that's what I assumed. Lucy had called her parents that morning and had spoken to them for an hour. My mother had spoken to them too, and it was decided that it was time for Lucy to go home. She would be put on a bus later that day. As I listened to my mother tell me and my father about these plans, I kept my eyes on Lucy, who didn't say a word. She was leaving. That was good. It was what I wanted to happen all along. However, it also meant that my one and only ally in this fight would be gone. That night, I would be truly alone. As it got closer to the time when Lucy was going to leave, she grew silent. She was watching me, thinking. She turned to my parents and tried to sound more upbeat and less traumatized, as she suggested that maybe I could go and visit her back home. She told my parents that finding a dead body would ruin anyone's summer, so some time away might be good for me. My parents told her that they'd think about it, but they said it in that tone of voice that parents use when they really mean that the answer is no. She tried. I had to give her points for that. Later that day, her bags were in my mother's car, and she was ready to go. She came to me near the front door and gave me a hug. As her arms were around me, Lucy whispered in my ear, "They want you to go to the field. Don't go." That was all she had time to say to me. She never told me what happened to her. After she hugged me, my father walked her to the car. She hugged him before she got in, and I saw her say something urgent to him, casting a look my way, but I didn't hear what she said. Then she got into the car, and my mother drove her away. I've only seen Lucy a couple of times since then. We haven't spoken much, and never about what happened that summer. Just cold pleasantries, spoken more out of obligation than anything else. She moved to the Netherlands 12 years ago, and I'm not sure that she's been back to the US since then. After she left my house that day, I felt more alone than I've ever felt in my life. I knew that the intruders were there even during the day. I knew that they could touch and move things. And now, I knew that I was the only target that they had left.
This is the voice of the Embers, where stories burn and fade.